right, thank you, Randy. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the violently variable climate of the late Triassic that witnessed the rise of early dinosaurs, shown here by Coelophysis. And I'll also be talking about the ascent of dinosaurs over the crocodile line archosaurs at the end Triassic mass extinction event, which only happened some 10 to 15 million years after this scene is depicted. And you'll see that I have chemical clues here as part of my title, and that's because I'll be showing you how we interrogate the rock record, so some rocks that we see like here on the right-hand side, and how we look for clues not just from body fossils, but also from chemical and even molecular fossils that lets us piece together a puzzle or a snapshot or a narrative so we can go from these rocks to a scene like this and say something about the environment and the climate at the time. And then we're going to use these lessons to inform our changing climate, so implications for future climate scenarios. Now the lessons come in two parts. The first is some like it a little less hot, and that's hard times for early dinosaurs. And then we're going to move on to part two, which is going to be focused in on the end Triassic mass extinction, which saw the rise of dinosaurs. And you see this title is of fire and ice. So we're not just going to be talking about violently variable climate in terms of warmth and destruction, but also cooling and destruction. So a lot of destruction, yeah. But that will be extinction and dinosaur dominance. Now as a backdrop, why is the Triassic important? Well, the Triassic was an extreme end member in terms of geography as well as climate. In the Triassic, all the world's land masses were united into one. This is a supercontinent Pangaea. It extended from pole to pole and quite resembled the Pac-Man. That becomes important later on when we start talking about climate. But an ambitious tetrapod could actually walk from pole to pole in its single lifetime. Despite that being the case, it turns out that biomes or zones of where organisms live are carefully actually enveloped by different climate regimes, and we're going to look at that. Now also, this is an end member in terms of climate, and specifically when we look at carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. Here we have a figure that's showing you the values of carbon dioxide from the present going back to the last 300 million years. And blue dots are carefully constructed chemical fossils that show you carbon dioxide going up and down, up and down. In the white bar, that's a prediction for the year 2100 of where our climate will be, how much CO2 will be in the atmosphere, and that's predicted to be 1,000 ppm. Currently, we're at 400 ppm. Now, it's been said the further we go into our future, the further we're actually going back into the past. These are the analogs, the tape recorders that tell us something about what to expect in our warming world and our warming future. When we look at this value, you see that you have to go quite far into the past to start getting at values that will be informative to our future climate scenarios. Now this is just the year 2100. In red we have, this is the Triassic. So the warmest interval, the highest CO2, is characterized at the Triassic at the rise of dinosaurs. Very, very warm. CO2 actually at values from 2,000 to 5,000 ppm. Those values are important because, as I said, as we keep going into the future, in the year 2200, values of CO2 are predicted to be 2,000 ppm. So if we were to follow this across, we'd have to go to the Triassic to understand what the world would be like. And we would stay there because if we were to burn all conventional and unconventional fossil fuels, that would be 12,000 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. That would be 5,000 ppm, and the only interval of time that preserves that is the Triassic. So I'm hoping I'm building the case for you that the Triassic is critical, both in understanding the origin and diversification of dinosaurs, their rise, but also for our warming world. This is the best analog we might have for our future. Now, CO2 is something that we measure, but there are also measurable consequences related to CO2. Everything's intertwined here. One of those is wildfires. And we have here below, this is a picture that's showing you a campfire 2 months ago in California, and it's wildfire. This is partially ascribed to higher CO2 because the intensity of wildfires is thought to increase with higher temperatures and longer dry seasons. So we'll see how that plays out during this interval of time as well. Now the Triassic is also very interesting because, as we heard yesterday, it represents the evolution between two major mass extinction events. Here we see the number of genera present, and we have time intervals that are showing you representation since the dawn of animal life on our planet 550 million years ago. So you see the number of animal genera that are present, and when you see dips, those are the mass extinction events. So this is the Triassic, and it's sandwiched in between the Great Dying at the in-Permian mass extinction and right before the in-Triassic mass extinction that allows for the ecological rise of dinosaurs. Now also the late Triassic, I could go on and on about why it's cool, but this is the unparalleled evolution of life on our planet in terms of the major components of today's ecosystem. They all originate within the late Triassic. And those are things like crocodiles, lizards, turtles, birds in the form of dinosaurs, as well as mammals, the group that we belong to. The Triassic representatives of those same animals, you can see here that they look vaguely familiar, but they're weirder, kind of more wonderful. The cast of characters is a little different. So here we have the crocodile line Archosaurus. So they're a little more graceful looking, running on all fours. And we have lizards, and we have turtles, and we have birds as dinosaurs, and then we have these early cute little mammals. We heard a little bit about those yesterday. We also have pterosaurs. They just came on the screen and flew off. Well, they also arise in the Triassic, and they're restricted into the Mesozoic, staying with us for just 150 million years. Now part one, so some like it a little less hot, hard times for early dinos. This is where we're going to start our story of using sedimentary records as time machines, so we're going back to this warm world. Now what we're setting out to do is we're looking for places where we have a great fossil record. So we have a great record of both early dinosaurs, shown here with Coelophysis, scaredly running away from that forest fire, and also the dinosaur-like creatures that are along living with Coelophysis, as well as the main predators of the day. So these are the Phytosaurs here, which is eating a little Drepanosaur, a lizard-like creature. Here we have a dearly departed, another Phytosaur, and another Phytosaur in the back here, and then we have these armored Aetosaurs. So this is a typical scene from the late Triassic. There's a lot of diversity going on here, and we do have dinosaurs present, but they're present as a small representation of that ecosystem, so they're not dominant in the ecosystem, even though they're there. Now we're just going to reorient ourselves in terms of geography and in terms of climate just one more time. Now through the rest of the slide, you can focus in up here. This is going to show you how to navigate or orient yourself in the Pangaean world. The dots will show you where you are in terms of the location of where the rocks are actually deposited. So that's the paleo latitude. And also we're going to orient ourselves in terms of climate space. And what we're looking at here is a record that's 27 million years long. We'll look at it again a little bit later. It shows you the Triassic and it shows you the Jurassic. We're going to start first off interested in this area known as Ghost Ranch from New Mexico, deposited at about 215 million years ago. And you can see again, so here's the CO2 values. They're ranging from 2,000 to 5,000 ppm. That's the chemical record that we're showing you. This is showing you higher CO2 on the right, lower CO2 on the left. And for comparison, I have in this blue line here, those are the present CO2 values in our modern atmosphere. Okay, so just for comparison, we're talking about high CO2, hot world. And I've also labeled the in-Triassic mass extinction here, and that's what I'm going to get into in the second part of today's talk. So extreme CO2, high temperatures, in fact, so high that you cannot sustain polar ice caps during this time. During the Triassic, there is no record of glacial ice anywhere on the planet. When you look at the mid to high latitudes, you get scenes that look like this. This is a heavily vegetated area. Those plants belong to modern groups that are frost sensitive. The plants are abundant. These high latitudes were very warm. So all of this is completely consistent with our paradigm for high CO2 hothouse worlds, what we'll be heading into. However, one thing that we want to make sure we're understanding is that just because the temperatures that are in the equator or the temperatures that are characterized at these high latitudes, just because they're both really high, and in fact, unlike today where we have cool temperatures in the polar ice caps, warm temperatures in the tropics, basically in the Triassic you have pretty much equal temperatures across. That does not mean that there's less variable climate, okay? So there can be regional huge fluctuations in climate. Just a point that we want to make sure that we understand as we progress. All right, now let's focus in on Expedition 1. So the first excursion we'll be talking about, and that's going out into the Chinle Formation. This crops out extensively in the American Southwest, and especially around and adjacent to the Colorado Plateau, which is shown here. Our studies just on the eastern flank of the Colorado Plateau. This is in the Chama Basin. This is north of Albuquerque. And when these rocks were laid down during the late Triassic, northern New Mexico was located here. So that's very close to the equator at about 12 degrees north latitude. In the modern world, that's the same latitude as the southernmost tip of India. The Chinle Formation's famous for fossils, including petrified wood that you can see here. This is from Petrified Forest National Park. And this is actually taken with a winterscape here. So in England, I don't get to see snow that all often, so there's going to be a lot of winterscapes to make everyone feel a little more at home. But this badland topography that we see here is not just characteristic of petrified forest, that's actually typical of the Chinle Formation throughout the American Southwest. And again, there's a diverse ecosystem that's present within here. Here's a picture that's showing you the beasts, the characters that are important for the Chinle Formation, and what we see is a very diverse system. So we have pterosaurs, again, we have the Phytosaurs, we have those armored Aedosaurs here, we have dinosaur cousins getting eaten by top predators of the day, the Phytosaurs. And yesterday, Dr. Sarah Werning was talking about that there are lots of variation in the life stories of this cast of characters, and was posing the question, well, what are the environmental conditions that are there where you see lots more diversity, lots more variation in terms of organisms that are present? Continuing on, the Chama Basin. Okay, so here we have the Chama Basin down here, and this is one of the most iconic outcrops of the Chinle Formation. This is in Ghost Ranch from New Mexico. And here you can see in green and gray, those are ancient river and stream deposits that are in these New Mexican badlands. For 60 years or so, this sequence has produced a spectacular fossil remains of a whole suite of organisms, including early carnivorous dinosaurs and many other kinds of animals. And some of the important fossiliferous localities are shown in this map here. Some of the spectacular fossils are shown over here on the left-hand side, and you can see really amazing specimens. So these include the early carnivorous dinosaur Tawa, described by many people who are sitting on the back bench, the armored enigmatic reptile Van Clevia that looks a bit like a dragon, and then the dinosauromorph Dromomeron, who's very well preserved as well. It's not just animals that are well preserved in these sequences, but also pollen and spores. You can see some beautiful pictures here with true color shown here. So they're bountiful, and that's let us say something about the changing vegetation in this area. Here's a view of the chimney area right here, and this is the outcrop of the sedimentary layers that is the Chinle Formation, which we're going to look at in more detail. Ghost Ranch was made famous by the American painter Georgia O'Keeffe, smiling at us over here. She spent a large part of her life living at Ghost Ranch, and she captured these Triassic beds in watercolor. You can see here the Chinle, when she wasn't, of course, imbibing in other extracurricular activities like driving motorcycles around. Here we're going to start building our actual chemical data to say something about the changing climate and environment. On the left-hand side, this is showing you the sedimentary section. So this is showing you the vertical thickness of the different rocks. That is a proxy for basically time. So we have the younger beds at the top and the older beds as you go further down into the sequence. And those colors are representing essentially the true color of the rocks that are there. Next to that, we have the key reptile groups that are present in this section, and we talked about what those were. So those are dinosaurs and close dinosaur relatives that are in this section. They exist for a long time, coexisting all together. But remember, dinosaurs were relatively rare, and when we talk about dinosaurs from this section, we're talking about carnivorous dinosaurs. There are no herbivorous dinosaurs from this section. The first proxy or chemical tool we're going to use are carbon isotopes, so there are different forms of carbon. And if you were here yesterday, you heard Dr. Soros talk about carbon-13 and carbon-12, and you got to pass a bowling ball and a ping pong ball around. And basically, so that's showing you fluctuations between those two, and it tells you something about ecosystem change. If there's lots of changes or lots of wiggles in the pattern, that means you have a disrupted ecosystem. And you can tell here it looks like kind of a drunk sailorman or something seesawing back and forth. So what this is telling us is that there's extreme ecosystem instability during this interval of time. We can also continue building our chemical toolkit by looking at soil horizons. So ancient soils have these little so-called carbonate concretions that are in them. Those concretions are formed back in the Triassic, and we can analyze the carbon isotopes from them to allow us to reconstruct atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere that was from 210 million years ago. And there's also a whole bunch of cores, so these little blebs here, that's all showing the carbonate nodules. When we do that, we come up with a curve that looks like this, and you can see that through the section, CO2 is increasing up to pretty high values towards the top of the section to 4,000. Now we can also look at the pollen data, so under a microscope, and that shows us that pollen, characteristic of arid versus humid times, switches in concert with the CO2. So basically it's another story that's showing high CO2 results in pollen that are indicative of arid regimes, lower CO2 indicative of pollen and more humid regimes. And then we can start looking at more measurable consequences of high CO2 and ecosystem instability, and that's looking at evidence for wildfire. So the first piece of evidence we have comes from the presence of abundant charcoal, so charred wood. And it turns out that if you can use both the abundance of that charcoal, but also you can look at its reflectance, so the light coming back under a microscope, and that actually tells you the temperature of the wildfire. So we can put that onto our screen here. So here we have in 4 discrete intervals, and these intervals where we have high CO2 and changes in our carbon cycling, you get the wildfires. And those wildfires are burning really high. They're actually burning up to 680 degrees Celsius. So just for comparison, an oven's burning at about 250 degrees Celsius. So these are hot, hot wildfires that are burning. Also, because there's a range in temperatures of the wildfires, that means that there's arid, violently fluctuating conditions, but there's variable amounts of plants that are actually accumulating, allowing for combustion for the wildfires to go forth. So we're going to look now at another chemical tool we can use to say more about wildfires throughout this section. And for that, we turn to molecules. So just like it's been said about diamonds, molecules are forever. And they are really cool. And this is what I specialize in, because molecules provide key clues of past life and its environment. Molecules are biomarkers. They're formed within the cell membrane, and so essentially they're fat. They're lipids. So if anyone's heard of Lipitor, these type of things, it's all basically fat. It's just a fat molecule. And just like skeletal fossils, there are fat molecules that are fossils. So in a living organism, you'll get a hydrocarbon skeleton that looks like this. Its fossilized version will look like this. So you can tell that they're related, but there have been some changes, just like if you look at something that's alive today and something that's its skeletal record, there will be a little bit of changes. And you can use these molecular fossils because they are found in all the 3 domains of life, and they tell you a variety of pieces of information. They tell you things like who made it, so what organism was actually present, and that's actually clues that were used for early life on our own planet. And also, as we look for life in other planets, we're capitalizing on this field of looking for molecular fossils because they're very robust and they get preserved really quite well. Also, they tell you about environmental conditions, so carbon cycling, they tell you about CO2, et cetera, et cetera. They can also tell you about temperature, so they become very important. Now, what do we do? How do we actually get them? Well, when I'm out in the field with my colleagues who are looking for dinosaurs and for other body fossils, I get they get really excited when they find them. I get excited for them too, but I get really excited when I find things like this. Yeah, that's a rock. This rock is dark colored, so that means it has a lot of organic matter. That means it has a lot of fat molecules in it. So I take that rock, and the first thing I do is I sacrifice it. I actually have to destroy it and use all that sample. I powder it up into remains like this, and then I take it to my lab, which has a very fancy, expensive espresso maker, essentially. And what that does, it looks like this. So it looks technical, but it really works just like an espresso maker. Under high pressure and under high temperature, I extract out the fat molecules. So you probably do that every day as well. In the analog here, you're also using a powdered sample. Your powdered sample is coffee grinds, and you're extracting out caffeine. Well, I'm using the sample, and I'm extracting out the total lipid, the total fat. And then I run a series of column chromatographs on it. You might remember this from grade school or from high school, where you took things on paper chromatography and watched it drop through different times, we do basically the same thing. So here we have a snapshot that's showing you one column, and we drip that total lipid extract in. We keep adding different solvents. That flushes the sample through. So this is the same column just through time, and it's showing you that a red thing comes out first and then a blue thing. This is basically just, a simplified version of, well, different compounds are going to come out at different times. Those compounds, we then take a syringe. We feel all scientific when we do that. We pick it up, and then we inject it into an instrument that's a mass spectrometer. This is a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, and all that does is it analyzes the relative abundance of different compounds by measuring the amounts of different molecular weights. So each compound, each fat molecule is associated with a different molecular weight, and that's what we're doing. So we look at the relative abundance of these, and we end up with beautiful figures that look like this. This is showing you retention time. This is showing you all the different molecules that come out, and this is showing you the power, so the relative abundance of these different molecules to each other. What that's telling you is, in this case, these are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're only formed by combustion, so combustion like in wildfires. And these structures are what we use for our molecular fossils. So now these actually end up in our record being much more abundant than the charcoal, and they indicate that there's fire in layers that we couldn't see relying just on the charcoal record. It also tells us that there's a burnt landscape that's susceptible to flooding. So when we plot our data here, now this is just showing you every interval where you see a peak here, those are wildfires. Here is our charcoal record. We had 4 horizons. When we look at the molecular fossils, it indicates that there are actually 24 horizons of wildfires. And that's saying that basically we have molecular evidence that the wildfires keep happening, the burnt landscape is susceptible to flooding, and then we can tell a bigger story here. So the climate, we said that it's characterized by high CO2. We know that it had some wet seasons, then it has extreme droughts in other seasons, and it gets punctuated by these raging wildfires, and because of the frequency of our molecular fossils, they must be happening every 10 years or so. So massive vegetation thrown, combusted by wildfires, and then we know from our charcoal record that they're burning at temperatures up to 680 degrees. All to say the conditions would be very, very bad. It would be very difficult to sustain abundant vegetation in this interval to grow and survive, probably why there are no herbivorous dinosaurs in the region. Now we're going to take a quick field excursion, this time to the exotic center of eastern North America. This is Connecticut, and it's a special part of Connecticut that's affectionately named the Grand Canyon of the state of Connecticut. That's really what it's called. Again, a winterscape here, and the reason that this is called the Grand Canyon of the state of Connecticut is because it's one of the clearest examples of climate changing the structural architecture of the rocks. And what I mean by that is that you see that it looks like these rocks, the colors are repeating. And that's because they are. This is a lake that was deposited during the Triassic, the coolest interval that ever existed. Well, not literally, but in terms of being awesome. And in this lake, it's shallowing, so it's getting really, really shallow, and then it's deepening. When it's shallowing, that's happening when there's less water present, and when it's deepening, that's when there's more water present. There's more water present when there's higher CO2. And we can actually look at that in a more quantitative way because these fluctuations in those intervals that are black, this is basically what you see up close. So you get these sediments, the layers are forming on top of each other like this. There's not mixing in the waters, churning them up. So that's a deep lake. Deep, things aren't burrowing, destroying the fossils. They get remarkably preserved like this fish. So those are in the deep lakes when there's lots of water present. When the lake dries out, and then remember this happens over and over again, when it dries out, it essentially becomes a soil. Dries to a soil, we know that because you can actually see the cracks from the soil cracking, and then dinosaur footprints are preserved, as are these beautiful microbial features that get all convoluted, and they get preserved in the rock record as well, allowing us to read the rocks. Now what's cool about that is that we can then build it into our toolkit. So we can use it as a proxy. We showed this before. This was that time scale that's showing you 27 million years from the late Triassic through the rise of dinosaurs, also the Triassic, which we'll visit a little bit later. This is focusing in on the Ghost Ranch section, and all we're showing here are those lake level variations through time. So it's showing you when the lake gets deeper or wetter, it's going to the right. When it dries out, it's going to the left. We know this because there is actually several cores and lots of outcrops, including the Grand Canyon of the state of Connecticut, off Route 9, if anyone's interested in going. And these cores, it's quite remarkable because there's actually over 3 miles of core, continuous core that's collected to represent this 27 million. And I've actually touched every single piece of this core, calloused hands. In any case, continuing on our story, so we have this quantitative record that's going through here. So here's our interval of Ghost Ranch here. All it's telling us is that lake levels fluctuate between being really deep and wet and being really, really dry. And we're going to build on this. Now, when we start building our other pieces, we're only interested in the overall trend here, just to enforce that these aren't isolated environmental conditions. They're all coupled, they're all interrelated, they're all linked. So our next proxy back to carbon dioxide. When we look at carbon dioxide, again, we're only looking at the overall trend here, this green line. And what we can see is that when we build CO2, it looks remarkably like our lake level pattern. Okay, so the trends in lake level changes and CO2 track each other really well over a really long time scale. So the wet-dry is coupled to CO2. In other words, CO2 is forcing the lake going wet and the lake going dry. Now we can also turn our attention to temperature. So this is another critical parameter, another piece of the climate puzzle. And we can see that it also, guess what, has the same exact pattern. So temperature is linked to CO2. CO2 is linked to lake level cycles. We can also look at strontium isotopes, some more chemical clues. And that tells us about chemical weathering and it tells us about erosion. And again, we see a pattern that looks very similar. So high CO2 changes chemical weathering and erosion. That's also correlated to the other graphs, which are correlated to temperature and to lake level cycles. So weathering's related to atmospheric CO2 and temperature as well. And then we can also further reconstruct water cycling. And to do this, we return to our molecular fossils. And now we're just looking at 2 forms of hydrogen from these molecular fossils. The details are pretty cool, but all we, again, are looking at is the pattern. So what happens with plants is that they have this leafy wax cuticle, and if anyone's worn chapstick, you know that kind of waxy feeling you find in your lips. Well, plants have that. They have this waxy thing, and it gets thrown off, it gets deposited into rivers and into lakes and so on. And we can actually extract the molecular signature from that. And when we do that, we can see that if it goes basically to more negative conditions, that's saying it's more humid. If it goes more positive, that's more arid. And so we have another link here where we have the water cycle repeatedly changing, going from droughts to floods, also linked to CO2 through our time interval. Now, bringing this back more broadly, okay, one of the most striking aspects of the late Triassic, we said that we had the Pac-Man-shaped Pangea. Even though we have all the continents that are coalesced into Pangea, and we said that the temperature gradients are muted, in other words, the temperature at the equator is not that far off from the temperature of the poles, there's a very strong biotic provinciality. In other words, there are zones of organisms that live in these bands. Here we're showing plants. So you see they're color-coded for the types of plants that are present, and you see those colors do not repeat. That's because they only live in these restricted zones. And this circle is showing you where the Chinle Formation, where the Chama Basin crops out, and that's in the semi-arid region. So these are the zones. Those zones in the southern part of Pangea don't match those in the northern Pangea. And the cool thing about these biozones, or this provinciality of plants, is that it's sustained for tens of millions of years. In fact, up until the end-Triassic extinction that allows dinosaurs to rise. In land-dwelling animals, that provinciality is even more extreme, and the best example of that is herbivorous dinosaurs. So herbivorous dinosaurs, they evolve in the earliest part of the late Triassic, and you can see them mapped out here. And by the time you get to 225 million years ago, they're amongst the most common fossils, but only at the high latitudes. So here are long-necked herbivorous sauropods. They're only at the high latitudes. They are not in the tropical regions. And that's despite the fact that within the tropical regions, there are lots and lots of bone-bearing beds, and there are hundreds of specimens of dinosaurs, but not a single specimen of an herbivorous dinosaur for this region for the entirety of the Triassic. And instead, in those low latitudes, it's creatures like this, the crocodile relatives, the crustaceans. Those are the most abundant herbivores and the most abundant carnivores. Now from the paleo high latitude, so this is an example that's from Europe, there are skeletons that are really abundant of herbivorous dinosaurs. This is one of the most famous. This is Plato Soros. And they're one of the most common tetrapods in the high latitudes. And they're one of the first tetrapods that are big enough that they're capable of actually reaching into higher branches of tall trees. They get up to 20 feet long. Now the question is, okay, well then why don't we have dinosaurs like this living in the tropics? And piecing together the story that we got from Ghost Ranch, well, we think it's because of the highly variable climate that's associated with those extreme wildfires. There's not a reliable food source. It doesn't allow the establishment of populations of organisms like this that have high metabolic requirements. And so they're ruled out. So that means that in the tropics, it's only those crocodile-like creatures that are surviving dinosaurs as carnivores in low proportions, again, until the end-Triassic mass extinctions when the dinosaurs take over. So the summary from part one, we looked at some ancient riverbeds in the Chinle Formation. That was from the western part of the US. We saw that there's frequent and extreme environmental conditions, including wildfires that come every 10 years or so. There's high atmospheric CO2. There's severe drought. That's what's actually prompting those wildfires. We saw when we turned to eastern North America that there were lakes providing a bigger backdrop story of high atmospheric CO2. It's interrelated to swings in evaporation and precipitation, lake level cycles, also temperature and weathering. And the take-home part of this is that the high atmospheric CO2 suppressed the dominance of dinosaurs in the tropics and resulted in the situation where you only have herbivorous, long-necked dinosaurs living in the high latitudes. Now, if we move forward 10 to 15 million years, we're now in younger geological real estate. We're now at the end-Triassic mass extinction. So we're getting into the beginning of the Jurassic, and we have here some fissure eruptions, so huge cracks or fissures in the Earth's crust, and that's allowing for gases to come out of the mantle. This is associated with the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. This part here, you see it's called a fire and ice extinction and dinosaur dominance, and that's because this extinction event allowed for the rise of dinosaurs. And in this picture, we actually have depicted some surviving sauropods over here. So the question is, what led to the survival of dominance of what led to the survival of dinosaurs, and actually how do we know anything about this end-Triassic extinction? Well, there's a hint about survivability, and it actually comes from a poem by the American poet Robert Frost. So it begins by, it's fire and ice, some say the whirlwind and fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted as desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So the question is ice actually sufficient for the rise of dinosaurs? We're going to get back to that. Just look first at the intensity of extinction. When we think about the end-Triassic extinction, because yesterday there was a focus on the end Permian, and the end-Triassic is very severe, and in fact, it depends on how you're measuring extinction, but in some ways, and I picked this out just because it is one that shows the end-Triassic being even more severe than the Permo-Triassic when you look at the land-dwelling animals. In any case, both marine and land organisms are affected by the end-Triassic, and if we focus in on just the reptiles, we can see at the end-Triassic extinction what goes extinct. So what's doomed? Well, that beautiful diversity of things that we saw from the western US, most of those guys are doomed. And when we get to the survivors, well, when we get to the survivors, what do we have? We only have small little crocodiliomorphs in the upper right surviving, these two little guys. Then the three main groups of dinosaurs, so the sauropods, the theropods, and the ornithischians. That's what gets through, and then I'll also add pterosaurs because they'll become important a little bit later on. The end-Triassic, we already said it's linked to these fissure eruptions. Well, it's triggered by the emplacement of this huge volcanic eruption that's related to the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. This is actually related to the rifting apart of Pangaea and the opening of the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the largest province of this nature in our entire solar system. It actually occupies 11 million square kilometers, and to give you a sense of how big that is, that's bigger than the continental United States, and it's 1/3 the size of our moon. So we're talking about massive fissure eruptions that's occupying about 20 to 30% of the globe at the time. So it's running all through Greenland, around eastern North America, the western contingent of Africa, the Gulf of Mexico, and actually underlains the Amazon flood basalts. Now, when it invades into local country rocks, it usually looks like this. This is from Canada, and this is showing you Triassic rocks, and this is that cold lava, which is known as a basalt. Well, as it's intruding through the local country rock, it's throwing up gases. That's depicted here. In the case of things like the Amazon basin, this is actually known as the Amazon Petroleum Province. A gift from the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province is actually more fossil fuel to burn. What it actually is showing, though, here's when it comes through, it's invading these country rocks, it's showing you the gases that come out with it. And it depends on the chemistry of the rocks that are inherent here. In this case, there's organic rich stuff. So that means that as lava's going through there, it's throwing up things like carbon dioxide, and it's also throwing out methane, which is even more powerful than carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases. And those get fingerprinted in the rock record as well. Now we also see another gas getting thrown out here, and that's sulfur dioxide. That's the one that's responsible for cooling. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. We've got greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. We've got cooling gases, sulfur dioxide. And we also have other gases, things like mercury that comes out of volcanism as well, which is another chemical tool that we can use. So how do we actually know that these are linked to the extinction? Well, we said that some of these gases are released. We talked about CO2 before, and this is showing you big pulses of CO2. These are the camp eruptions, so there are multiple eruptions of camp through this interval, and that leaves a fingerprint in the carbon isotope record as well, which is known from land and ocean. So the details of this aren't important, but what is that no matter what site you look at, you see that fingerprint in the carbon isotopes. And also here's that mercury. So right at the Triassic extinction, where we have a release of carbon from carbon dioxide and methane, we also have mercury, huge mercury peak, linking it directly to the basalts from the lavas themselves, the camp lavas. We have another control on this. These are uranium lead dates from zircons that are from the camp lavas. All the camp lavas are just shown in these colors here. And all this is showing you is that they precisely are linked to the same age as the extinction event. And then we can clearly see from the carbon dioxide record, every time you get a camp lava, you get a doubling to tripling of CO2. So it starts in an already warm world, it starts getting, guess what, even warmer. Now, because we're talking about timing, I just want to clarify a little bit about timing of mechanisms associated with mass extinctions. So there are different time scales. In black we have here, these are physical things that are happening, and in blue, this is related to the biological response. So within a day, you're going to get a blast of volcanic dust, and that's going to result in individual deaths on a local scale. From weeks to decades, you're going to get things like volcanic winter. This takes its name after nuclear winter during the Cold War, where the idea was if a nuclear bomb is dropped in one place, there are far-field effects that places around the Earth are actually going to feel. And there include things like cooling. That's something that results in population decline, also migration. Then there's centuries to millennia, so this is related to global warming, and that's when we have extinctions, we have species-level evolution, and fragile ecosystems. And then we have millions of years for carbon cycle response. That results in evolution, adaptive radiations, and as talked about yesterday, new ecosystem norms. So let's look at these long intervals, so for the actual warming, and we're going to look at conifer trees, and we're going to see something pretty clear. So this is a picture, I've showed these pictures, but this is actually known from 3,000 fossils of plants. When we're in pre-extinction, there's lower CO2, and we have these conifers. They look quite fleshy. Well, they just look, you know, happy, healthy plants. They have big leaves. They also, you see these little thing up here. This is a stomate. That's a hole that allows for gas exchange with the atmosphere. That's what allows a plant to have photosynthesis. So atmospheric CO2 is coming in through this hole, and you can see that it looks, you know, quite normal. Post-extinction, again, over millions of year timescale response, this is what we get, evolutionary adaptations in plants. They are much smaller. They're spindly conifer trees with leaves, and they have hairy sunken stomates. We also see a big change when we look at dinosaur footprints. So these are to the same scale. Pre-extinction in the Triassic, this is the size of a dinosaur footprint. Afterward, we get this. That footprint size immediately increases across the extinction by about 30%. That equals a doubling of mass. And this map shows the distribution of dinosaurs as they spread globally in the early Jurassic. So this is the story of the ascent, the reign of dinosaurs. And here you can see the three major groups of dinosaurs, the theropods, the carnivorous ones, the sauropods, the long necks, and the ornithischians. And you can see that now they're found in every latitudinal zone. So the Triassic zoning that we saw before, where the herbivorous dinosaurs were in the high latitudes and carnivores in the low latitudes, that's completely wiped out. A little bit later on today, Dr. Nate Smith will go into more detail about early Jurassic dinosaurs, so stay tuned for that. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the short-term cooling, and to do that, we're now going to talk about more recent events. And a really recent event of this induced cooling comes from the Mount Pinatubo eruption. This happened in the Philippines on June 15th in 1991, and this was the largest volcanic eruption to affect a very densely populated area. When I mean densely populated, I mean by humans. Now, in this case, this eruption produced a bunch of hot ash and gas, and actually an avalanche of hot ash and gas. Giant mud flows come out, and there's a huge cloud of volcanic ash, which is shown here. It's hundreds of miles across. Spewed out is also sulfur dioxide. We saw that before when we were talking about the camp. Now, sulfur dioxide combines with water, and that forms a haze of tiny droplets, which are known as aerosols, which you can actually see in this picture. So that's up here, these hazy droplets. And what happens there is that you get reflective haze where sulfur droplets allow cooling. The way it works is that they reflect a lot of sunlight for their size. So they're actually reflecting sunlight back out to space, which means sunlight's not coming in, which means it's getting cooler because the dust and the sulfur aerosols are dimming the sun. So it results in cooling. Cooling lasts for as long as 2, 3, 4 years after a major eruption throwing sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere happens. Now, there are further clues about sulfur dioxide and historical records of volcanism, and they actually come from journals of well-known artists and painters. In fact, this picture here from Edward Monk's The Scream, that's actually in his notebook from the eruption of Krakatoa, which happened in 1893, and he painted that picture just 10 years later, and he said that he was at a bridge and felt that he needed to scream because of the bloody red colors of the sky. Those colors were that way because of the sulfur dioxide coming from the volcanic eruption itself. Then we also have the tale of, well, this series is on the origin of dinosaurs, another ferocious beast, in this case Frankenstein. This actually also comes from volcanism because Mary Shelley was locked away in a cabin with several other people, including the person who first put vampires out into the world. And they were in a freezing situation in Lake Geneva, riding together after the Tambora eruption in 1815. That was known as a year without a summer. That killed 90,000 humans from the eruption itself, but then there was massive consequences related to that, because remember, everything that we're talking about with the environment is completely interrelated. So you get people that first die by the eruption itself, by the volcanic ash spewing forth, and from mud flows, but also it results in complete widespread crop failure and famine, and then also the emergence of infectious diseases like the typhoid epidemic that broke out, which actually ended up killing millions of people. So just as sort of an analog to what we're thinking about when in these past situations. Now, you also see that there are several eruptions shown here, and they're all plotted here because what this figure is showing is that sulfur emissions and temperature decrease. So the amount of cooling that's responsible for the amount of sulfur aerosols going out into the atmosphere. And for all of these, despite all that disruption that I told you about, several million people died at the time of this, of Frankenstein coming out. In fact, that was Mary Shelley's way of depicting her dismal feelings about this, was to create Frankenstein. All of that only results in an overall temperature decrease of 2 degrees. So these bars here are all in log scale or orders of magnitude change. So this 2 degree, 10 to the 1 to 10 to the 2 is representing a 100-degree decrease in temperature. And if we talk about that, you're talking about freezing temperatures. If you then postulate and project out where would camp, so the central land magmatic province, remember we said that's volcanism on a whole other level because that's volcanism representing a third the size of the moon of stuff throwing out. That produces a cooling that's up in this range, which is between 10 degrees and 20 to 30 degrees C, which would indicate that the tropics actually freeze. Now, if we start working back, okay, so how do we actually test this? I can tell you there's no freezing at this extinction event in the tropics, but if we go to higher latitudes and start sleuthing it out, we come up with some very interesting findings. So in pursuit of this test, we go up to the northwest part of China, and this time we're looking at coal-bearing beds. and we have some great field partners like this camel here. And you can see this arrow, well, that's pointing to some of these layers that have these coals and also has some very curious remains. It turns out in the high latitudes here, remember these are these sites that in the Triassic had the herbivorous dinosaurs, there's lots of footprints of the herbivorous dinosaurs. There's also things like here's a little tooth from an amphibian. And then there are some very curious things like this plant fossil here. This plant fossil has adaptations for the cold. So that's very cool. And also we have things like this, which is a big clast or a big pebble that's inside of a fine-grained mudstone, which is very curious because it's a drop stone, so it couldn't have gotten there unless there was a glacier present that's moving it along and then just basically dropping it, plop, there it is. Now, there's another thing that we have here, and that's something called lake ice rafted debris. And we can see this when we start separating out the rocks. We see that there are pebbles of different sizes. When we start building together these pieces, you know, we're using the chemical fossils, we're relying on our colleagues of the vertebrate paleontologists for the body fossils. We're also scrappy, we're reading the rocks, so anything that we can to tell a story about how that rock came to be, what was happening, we use. Now in this case, what we're envisioning is that for ice rafted debris, what happens is, if you imagine a lake, at the shore of a lake, if it freezes to the bottom. As it's doing that, it picks up little pebbles and little debris along the way. And then when the ice breaks up and starts to thaw, so it starts to melt and it drifts out into the lake and it drops down these pebbles or these clasts and it starts isolating those pebbles and clasts of grains into the mud. And when you do that, when you start sifting out, you see these. So these are pebbles that are all very different sizes, right smack dab in the middle of a lake. So there's no way it could have gotten there unless it was pulled over by ice and then just dropped down. And this is something that in the modern world you see specifically related to seasonal ice rafted debris in lakes that have freezing winters. So seasonally frozen lakes produce things like ice rafted debris, and that's something that we have at that extinction event from the high latitudes. Now there's also another line of evidence that there's actually ice related to volcanic winters, related to camp at this extinction event, and that comes from the pattern of the extinction itself when we looked at floral changes. So on land, the Triassic extinction for plants is consistent with volcanic winters. What we have here is, this is the record of plant extinction pulled out by latitude. And so you can see the transect up here. This is in the tropics, and this is progressively getting higher latitude. And what you see that when you're at the tropics, you get a decimation of plants. So 50% of plant taxa all go extinct. As you progressively get higher, well, it's a little bit less here, and you can see the severity of extinction depicted here, so that when you get to 70 degrees north, it's basically not hit at all in terms of the plants, possibly because they're, you know, it's frozen up there, and there are some adaptations for ice. Now, the other thing that we have is, well, why did dinosaurs survive, and what does that have to do with this scenario of ice in the Arctic? And one thing that maybe provides a clue is that pterosaurs and dinosaurs have insulating filaments. They're kind of proto-feathers, and you can see from the fossils here, so these are the little proto-feathers that are preserved. This is a pterosaur here, and then there are little proto-feathers that allow for insulation for the dinosaurs as well. This is shown up here because at the Triassic extinction, we said that what gets through, well, it's dinosaurs, and pterosaurs are virtually unaffected across the extinction, as are a couple of crocodiliomorphs. So possibly dinosaurs actually survive because they have some cool adaptations that are inherently present within them, and that scenes that look like this, which is showing volcanism coming through, should actually maybe look like this, another little winterscape for our pterosaur and the dinosaur. So to sum up part 2, we saw that we had camp eruptions. They result in a doubling to tripling of CO2, and this happens over really long durations. So we said this happens over hundreds of thousands of millions of years, and these are during hothouse intervals. Then we have cascading environmental effects. Those include warming and volcanic winters. And when we talk about the volcanic winters, what we want to put into context is that, so we have these warming intervals, but superimposed on the warming intervals are short-lived volcanic winters. these volcanic winters would be of large magnitude. In other words, we saw that it was dropping temperatures between 10 and 30 degrees C, but it's a very short duration. Remember, those volcanic winters are only lasting like 2 or 3 years. We also looked at evidence for seasonal ice in the Arctic. So remember, we saw that there was ice rafted debris in lakes, that we saw that there were plants adapted to the cold that are actually preserved there, and we saw the pattern of extinction itself, where the tropics are hit hard, but not the high latitudes. And then we have this prediction of relationships of insulation and patterns of the pterosaurs and the dinosaurs. So we said maybe those proto-feather insulation gave dinosaurs an edge to outcompete the crocodile-lion archosaurs. And then another part of the summary is just to remember that the physiology and local adaptations could be major controls on survival and extinction of groups. So the take-home message, when we think about both parts, both the context, the violent variability of climate and the rise of dinosaurs, and then their ascent, the take-home message we saw here was that the late Triassic and the Intriassic extinctions, these are excellent natural experiments allowing for information on future climate scenarios. They show a powerful link among CO2, among the intensity of the water cycle, among temperature and weathering. Then we said that under high CO2, the dominance of dinosaurs is suppressed. There's high climate variability, there's extensive wildfires in the tropics, and that's where the crocodile-lion taxa are dominant. When we talk about extinction, at the end Triassic, dinosaurs survive at the expense of crocodile-like archosaurs, and that's maybe because they had features that allowed them to survive in the cold. All right, just some acknowledgements. Thank you very much.